Neil MacGregor, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Where did the idea come from to tell the history of the world and humanity through objects?
Well, it really came from the beginning of the British Museum in 1753, because what Parliament decided to do then was to put into one place things from all over the world so that you could think about the whole world as one story. And we began wondering how we could make this real now. And how could you do what the 18th century wanted to do, to think about the whole world as connected by looking at the things. And then a conversation with the BBC, and we thought originally 10 objects, and it grew to 20, and ultimately we seemed to settle on 100.
Now, as you acknowledge yourself in the book, this is a mission impossible. What sort of criteria did you set?
Well, it's a ridiculous thing to try to do, obviously. We tried to go from the beginning to now, so from about 1.5 million years ago, when we start making those hand axes in Central Africa, in Tanzania, right up to today. We wanted to be able to look at the whole world at the same moment in history several times. So take the world around, say, 800 AD, and just spin the globe and look at what's happening in China, in the Middle East, in Mexico, whatever. So that you would keep getting the idea of the world as one world, similar kind of people, trying to do similar kinds of things but in different circumstances. The other thing we wanted to do was to make it clear that there isn't one story from an object.
How much are these objects, like ourselves, able to be refashioned, remodelled, taken somewhere else and jump into another age and therefore take on a new identity?
Well, that's because the great joy about working with things rather than texts. I mean, a text is always somebody saying something which says roughly the same thing. We may read it a bit differently, but it's the same thing. If you take something like the Rosetta Stone, I mean, that's a wonderful example. It's made as a public announcement of an extremely boring tax law, that you'll get tax relief if you do certain things, that the priests will get certain advantages if the pharaoh gives them certain tax benefits. And it's rolled out. It's like a bylaw set up in stone. Nobody, when they carved the Rosetta Stone, thought for a second that it would one day become the only means for us of reading ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. So that's the joy of the thing. It means something completely different at different points.
Now, some of the objects you've chosen are very small, such as a Victorian tea set, and you think, well, that probably tells a story about the household in which that was used. Yet you say it tells a much bigger, wider and more profound story.
Well, that's what we wanted to show, that the simple things we use every day have for a very long time been part of the whole story of the world. So the Victorian tea set, I mean, why is it that Britain is able to import these huge quantities of cheap tea from India? Well, that's because they brought the tea from China and replanted it in India after brutal opium wars in China. It's also because, of course, the sugar has to come from the West Indies, where slavery has just been abolished, but it's part of a different story of imperial exploitation there. And then milk. How do you get milk into a Victorian city? That's another bit of social engineering in Britain. So that tea set, which we all think of as totally normal, we've all grown up with tea sets, but actually it's a particular moment of a global economy, of power being exercised in different ways, people moved, plants moved, and a new kind of society created. And the simple things actually tell you that usually better than the grand public things.
Can this be applied to any given object, do you believe?
Well, I think it can. That's why the next to last object we chose, the 99th object, was a credit card, which everybody uses. But we chose a credit card issued by a bank that's based in London, that trades a great deal in the Far East, and it's about Islamic banking. It's to work within the Islamic banking conventions. And what that tells us is, of course, a huge amount about global finance today, of the last 100 years, the new dominance of Middle East, of Islamic concerns in banking. These simple objects, once you start unpicking them, tell the story of us and the world.
It really opened my eyes to how early on human beings built not just functional things, but they were creative beings, spiritual beings, celebrating being sexual beings. And these objects that you've found show that. How surprising was that for you?
Well, for me personally, it was a complete revelation, because I had no idea that you could actually ask questions like, when do people start representing being in love with somebody else? When do we start thinking about how extraordinary it is that the animal world works as it does? And to find objects of 10, 15,000 years ago looking at a couple making love with all the tenderness that you'd expect in an image of that today is very moving, because it puts you in this long tradition that you know must have been there. But to know that people 15,000 years ago thought it was important enough to make an image of is marvellous, and be able to hold it. So that sense of continuity through the things, that we are part of a story that's always been about everybody and is going on, we're just a little bit of it.
Now, as a case in point, behind you there is a statue of a Buddha. What story is that stone telling you?
That stone tells you a very interesting story, I think, because it's obviously a statue of the Buddha, but it's from Indonesia, it's from central Java. But the model of the Buddha is in fact Indian. The style, the shaping of the features. And it demonstrates, of course, that Buddhism comes to Indonesia from India. It comes as part of that great trade of the Indian Ocean that brings Hinduism as well to Indonesia, and ultimately Islam. And that all these religions come by sea trade to Indonesia to make Indonesia today. It also, in terms of the story that we were trying to tell in this series, makes another quite important point, because it's a Buddha like that Stamford Raffles, the man who eventually founded Singapore, collected in Java and wanted to send to London. And he wanted to send it to London because he had become convinced that the civilization of Java was the equal of Greece and Rome, and that Europeans didn't know that. And they would only believe that Java had produced a civilization of that level if they could see a couple of objects like the one behind me. And I think it worked. Those things had an enormous resonance in London, and they dislodged that comfortable European assumption that only Europeans made great stone sculpture.
How challenging is it in the 21st century for a museum to do what you've done here, to engage audiences, to bring them in, to show them an object and say, this tells a compelling story about yourself?
Well, I think the fact that we're sitting in the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and the visitor figures here are higher than they've ever been. People come more and more to look at objects. The same is true in the British Museum, higher numbers than ever before. And I think that's because people want to look at the real thing, but above all they want contact with the people that made those things and how those people thought. They want to explore other worlds. The best way into another world, different from your own, is through the things that world has produced. And that's what museums offer.
Neil MacGregor, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.